Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your company, and I'm pleased to be back. Not quite 100%, but I appreciate Dr. Tabor covering for me last week. Again, thank you to everyone who's joining us on our live stream, Facebook, our live stream on YouTube, or who might download this later on any number of, as they say, wherever you get your podcasts. So we're really doing a drive right now to get the audio classes out there. And pretty much all of the major distributors of audio content now carry United Israel World Union's podcast. So you can find it on Pandora and Google and Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, you name it. So I say that because a lot of you may not know, but I often get correspondence where people tell me that they enjoy downloading and listening to the audio later. So just so you know, this is class number 25 in our ongoing study of the text of the Pentateuch. We're roughly following the annual cycle of readings that the Jewish people, for the most part, follow, at least in conservative branches and Orthodox branches. Reform typically follows more of a triennial cycle of readings. It's not the ancient triennial cycle of readings, but it's a modified triennial cycle. But we're following the annual cycle of readings. Last week, the annual cycle of readings entered into the book of Leviticus with the initial reading of the book of Leviticus. This week is actually the second reading according to the annual cycle of readings. It's called Tzav. So you had Vayikra and then Tzav. Well, today, what I've decided, because I wasn't here last week, and Dr. Tabor and I had discussed, he wanted to cover another topic to allow me to cover the cycle of readings. So today I'm going to teach a class that combines parts of Vayikra, the first reading of Leviticus, and parts of Tzav. Now the reason I can do that is because this reading goes all the way through the end of chapter 7, and it just so happens that what I wanted to cover involves the sacrificial system. So today's class, I'm going to be talking about sacrifices and offerings, which are covered fairly thoroughly in chapters 1 through 7 of Vayikra, of Leviticus, which in a sense works out better that I'm doing it this way. So today we begin the study of what is known in most of the English-speaking world at least, as Leviticus. Leviticus, it's associated with, the word really means pertaining to the Levites. This is Levitical literature. Now, when I say Levitical literature goes beyond Leviticus. In other words, there are quite a few texts within the Bible, not only within the Pentateuch, but within other bodies of literature that make up our Bible, that are priestly, if you will, Levitical for sure. And so I coined the phrase, I like to call it Levitical literature, because there should be a distinction, and it will be made over the next weeks, months, years, decades, as long as God allows me to teach, between Levites and priests. And I might even say it this way. Perhaps there's not as much of a line of demarcation between the two as people have imagined. But be that as it may, we're dealing with Levitical literature for certain when we look at Leviticus, as the name implies. Some refer, even in ancient sources, early sources, refer to the book of Leviticus as Torat Kohanim. Now, Torah is a word, for those of you who study Hebrew, it means, Torah means Torah of. The Torah of are the instructions of the priest. That's what some people call it. The traditional Hebrew name of the book of Leviticus is Vayikra, and that comes by in typical fashion. The Jewish people typically will refer to a book by either the first word that occurs in the Hebrew text of that book or the first meaningful word that stands out within the first line or two of the book. So Vayikra is the word that is used as the title of the book in Jewish circles, and it's because of a phrase that appears right out of the gate. When you open the Leviticus 1:1, it says, Vayikra el Moshe, Vayikra el Moshe, and he called to Moses. And he called to Moses. Now, that particular phrase, Vayikra el Moshe, appears only one other time in all of the Hebrew Bible. Now, you would probably think, well, that'd be a good place to start. You know, what's the connection? I'll tell you right now, it's outside the scope of this class, but I will tell you that it is in Exodus chapter 24 and verse 16. It says there, as well as Vayikra 1:1, Exodus 24:16 says, Vayikra el Moshe. It too is Levitical literature. And there is a connection, and it's on a deep level, but it's too deep to get into today. The book, Vayikra, Leviticus, is highly regarded within Judaism in particular. In fact, in more Orthodox circles, Jewish children begin their religious education with Vayikra. And the reason, according to these authorities, that you would begin a child in Vayikra, I'll be honest, I wouldn't begin my children there, but the reason is that the saying is that the pure, i.e. the children, should devote themselves to the study of purity. So if Leviticus, at its core, represents things which indicate purity or an alert to something which is not pure, in other words, the discernment between that which is pure and that which is impure, between that which is common and that which is holy or set apart, the idea is that these things, these distinctions, should be taught to the children at a very early age. That I agree with. I think we need to instruct our children to discern the difference between right and wrong, between good and bad, between clean and unclean. Those are the things that I agree with. I think those are very important and essential. Leviticus contains 27 chapters, and these 27 chapters in many ways stand apart from all other biblical literature. Starkly, like really, when you read Leviticus 1 through 27, you'll see things that really seem different. It's unique, stands apart from everything else. There is a minimal amount of narrative in the book of Leviticus. And by narrative, I mean story that goes with the text. Most of Leviticus is presented as the communication from Jehovah through Moses, and it is for the purpose of communicating laws and statutes and judgments and so forth. So there's not a lot of narrative. And Moses went up the mountain and he did. In fact, when you read Exodus, when you read Numbers, it's fast-paced. There's all kind of stuff going on. There are people making golden calves with the help of the high priest. There are all these other things going on. But Leviticus is just, Vayikra el Moshe. And he called unto Moses and said. And then there are these long sections of text, not narrative, but sections of text which deal with the communication of legal material. Not a lot of poetry. In fact, most scholars say there's no poetry in Leviticus. And by poetry, you can look up biblical poetry and understand what I mean. I'm not going to go into that at this point. Most of Leviticus is laws, and most of the laws are priestly matter. Things pertaining to this special cadre of selected individuals within the larger body of the nation of Israel, whose sole purpose it is to teach the children of Israel the distinctions between pure and impure, holy and unholy, and things like that. The exceptions to the rule. There are four sections of text which deal with narrative. The first one occurs in chapter 8. We're not going to get there. But chapter 8 deals with the ordination of Aaron and his sons, or the consecration of the priesthood, I guess you could say. And that's in Leviticus 8. We get into that next week, so you have to join in. Leviticus 9 deals with the dedication of the Mishkan, the dedication of the tabernacle. That too will probably be covered in next week's class. And then the other two sections of narrative, one is in Leviticus chapter 10. It deals with the crime and the punishment of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu. Remember, we're going to talk about what did they do? They did something involving strange fire, and God kills them, right? And then Aaron is told by Moses, let's go. It's time to go. But we'll get to that too. Chapter 24 is the fourth exception to the all legal matter ruling for Levitical literature, and that is chapter 24 deals with the story of a blasphemer and how that blasphemer, what did he do, what did he say perhaps, and what was the punishment for that. Now each of these narrative blocks gives a context, if you will, for more legal matter. So really, when you back up and you look at Leviticus, when you look at Vayikra, it's all about law. It's all about priestly law pertaining to the priest. Now, what's interesting about the narrative is that some of what we meet with in Vayikra is told elsewhere in the text of the Pentateuch, and it's told differently. Now, what does that allow us to do? It allows us to do some horizontal reading as we get there. So if we talk about the ordination of the priest, of Aaron and his sons, we'll look at that section in Leviticus 8, and we'll compare it with in Exodus where that same ordination takes place, and we'll compare and contrast and so forth. Now, many people, many dear, lovely people, well-meaning, well-intentioned people have sought to harmonize and reconcile any distinctions between variant readings within the text. What I like to do is highlight these and ask questions as to why are they different. So for instance, if it says it one way in Leviticus and it says it a different way in Exodus, the question becomes, what is it that the authors are trying to say, and how are they trying to say it, and are we certain that it's a different author, and how do we go about proving that, etc. One other thing about Leviticus before we get rolling into the class today is that Moses is no longer the focus. I mean, sure, the bulk of Vayikra is communicated from Jehovah through Moses to the people, but he's just that intermediary. He's just that communicator. There are no stories about Moses, really. I mean, he's mentioned. But my point is that the focus is no longer on the person of Moses, nor any other person for that matter in Leviticus. Leviticus is not so much about people. It's about laws and institutions and not individuals. Now, in Leviticus, when individuals come into the picture, they are primarily Aaron or his sons, and where others interact in that narrative, they're secondary, okay? So I just want to give you kind of a frame up on what to expect when we get to Leviticus. And a lot of you are thinking, well, I've read Leviticus over and over and over, and I know it very well. what I hope to do and pray to do is to present some things about the text of Leviticus that you may not have thought about, that you may not have considered, and that's why this series is a new look at the Pentateuch, a new look at Levitical literature, and so that's what we're going to do. Now, Leviticus presents itself as going back to Sinai. So Leviticus is presented as going all the way back. Your date may be different than mine, but roughly 1500 BCE, and it presents itself as being communicated during the time in which the children of Israel are at Horeb, or at Sinai. Remember, Levitical literature typically doesn't use Horeb, it uses Sinai. There's a clear distinction in the literature where Sinai is the favored priestly term for this sacred precinct, if you will. Now, I want to give you a timing as far as the book presents itself to begin with. So if you think about it, not just Leviticus is communicated at Sinai. I'm going to use Sinai from here forward as I go through Leviticus. When we get to Deuteronomy, it'll be all Horeb, so get ready for that. But at Sinai, according to Exodus chapter 19, we know when the children of Israel arrive. I'm going to cover this in a minute. We know when they arrive at Sinai, and we know that they don't leave Sinai until Numbers chapter 10, verse 11. Now, everything in between, let's call it like it is. It is that which takes place at the foot of Sinai. Exodus 19, Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, that's the period of time covered textually at Sinai. Now, where do we place ourselves in the chronology of things? This is the question that I want to begin with, assuming that the fundamentalist view is correct and this material dates back to Moses' time and to Sinai. Where does the Bible place us chronologically, okay? So I want to go those verses that I used to start with. Let's go to Exodus 19. We're going to begin there, and I'm going to go through some text to sort of square us up, to draw a square around chronologically where we are at. Exodus 19:1. On the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Having journeyed from Rephidim, they entered the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness. Israel encamped there in front of the mountain. Okay? So this gives us a starting point for the time at Sinai. Clock begins to tick. Right here, when? Third new moon. Now, what day of the month is it? It's the first day. It's the new moon. So, month number 3, day number 1, this is the first year, right? This isn't year 2, this is year 1. So what I want you to do, if you take notes, you do what you want. They're your notes, but this is my advice. You want to track as I go through year, month, day. So this is year 1, day 1, month 3, in whatever order you want to write it. You Europeans do it differently than Americans, so however you want to say, first day, third month, first year. Now, this is where the clock begins for time at Sinai. Now, go with me to Numbers, Bamidbar. By the way, I can't wait to get to Numbers. Numbers chapter 10, verse 11. Now, listen for the dates. In the second year on the 20th day of the second month. Does that give you a year, month, day? Absolutely. Second year, 20th day of the second month, the cloud lifted from the tabernacle of the pact, and the Israelites set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud came to rest in the wilderness of Paran. So again, what we know is first year, first day, third month, they arrive at Sinai, and they don't leave until second year, 20th day of the second month. So that means they're almost at Sinai for a year. You see that? It's pretty simple math. If it wasn't simple math, I wouldn't even do it because I'm not good at math. So almost a year at Sinai. Now what happens in that year? Well, it's partly covered in Exodus, partly covered in Leviticus, partly covered in Numbers. In other words, a vast majority of the Pentateuch takes place at Sinai. It's there, right? Now, we're going to continue to tighten this up. My friend Dave Tyler always talks about the theory of constraints, where you look at all the data sets and you narrow your focus, which is what we do. It's what we should do. It works in business. It works in biblical studies. Now, Exodus 40 ends. Let's go to Exodus 40. We're trying to box in our time here in Leviticus. Exodus chapter 40 ends on the first day of the first month of the second year. So look at Exodus 40, and let's read verse 1. And the Lord and Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, on the first day of the first month you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. Now, if you're doing your little chart, you say, wait a minute, Ross, I don't have a year. I have a month and a day. So what we know from this piece is that God tells Moses, first day of the first month, you're going to set up the tabernacle and the tent of meeting. Now look at verse 17. This fills in the gap for us. In the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle is set up. All right, so now we've got it. Second year, first month, first day. Now, chapter 40 of Exodus is the end of the time at Sinai, basically. It's wrapping it up, right? So when did they leave? Remember, they leave second year, second month, 20th day. Here it says that the tabernacle goes up first month, first day, second year. So you see how long the tabernacle is set up? How long is it? Well, it goes between those two dates. The tabernacle is set up at Sinai. It doesn't move. It's set up and stays there. And a lot of stuff happens, which we'll talk about. And then, according to Numbers 10, 11, and following, the cloud lifts, they take up the tabernacle, and they move. There's basically 1 month of time. If you read the end of Leviticus, the end of Exodus, if you read the end of Exodus, you have a date. If you read the beginning of Numbers, you have a date. Look with me at Numbers chapter 1. Numbers chapter 1. This, by the way, is important, even if it seems a little bit detailed. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. On the first day of the second month, in the second year following the exodus from the land of Egypt, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, saying, take a census. Okay. So the reason I want to draw this out is because it tells us that between Exodus 40 and Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, it's a month. Very easy math. It's 1 month. Now, what this did to me and others who've studied the text of the Pentateuch is it made me conclude that Leviticus covers 1 month between the end of Exodus and the beginning of Numbers. I mean, that's a pretty logical assumption because you find it located there in the text. Leviticus is right in the middle of that. So you say, well, it has to happen in that 30 days sometime. Doesn't have to take all 30 days, but it happens between Exodus and Numbers. But let me tell you what I now know. By doing that, by putting the things that are covered in Leviticus in that month, I am taking too much from too little. I'm deriving too much with too little evidence. It's not that simple. Why? Here's why. Everything seems to be in order, but there is a lack of narrative material in Leviticus to absolutely for certain place it chronologically. Remember, there are only 4 things covered that are dealing in narrative. Now, the first question that I came into, and really I've learned some of this week, is I said, let's look at the narrative material within Leviticus and see if I can't find where it happens, maybe mentioned elsewhere in the text of the Pentateuch, and thereby get a better feel for when it took place. An example is the ordination of Aaron and his sons. When does that take place? We have a story about that elsewhere. I'm just giving you the points. We'll get into this in another class. So the little bit of narrative that we do have in Leviticus is covered in other books with other details. We'll look at that as we meet it. Now, the other thing that I need to tell you is that neither Exodus nor Numbers, the bookends for Leviticus, follow a strict chronological reading either. Example, go with me to Exodus chapter 40. Exodus chapter 40 and verse 36. Exodus 40, 36. When the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on their various journeys. But if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out until such a time as it did lift. For over the tabernacle, a cloud of Jehovah rested by day, and fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. Now, when you read that, does anything go off in your head that makes you think, let me tell you what I think. They've yet to move. At this point, chronologically, as the texts are presented, this is Exodus 40. Remember, they don't move until Numbers chapter 10, verse 11 and 12. Now, that doesn't mean to imply, nor am I suggesting that this is not true or that it doesn't reflect historical accuracy. I believe that it is true. I believe that it is historically accurate. But I do not believe that Exodus 40, verse 36 through 38, appears in its chronological place. This is written later by someone outside of these journeys in time. Someone who is now reflecting on and writing, if you will, in retrospect about the journey. This person, remember in Exodus 40, the tabernacle is set up at Sinai, but it has yet to move. So the writer at this point in Exodus 40 says, oh, and by the way, let me tell you this. When there's this cloud and it's over the tabernacle, and whenever God wants them to move, it lifts up and it moves to the new location and it stays still, and that's where they set up the tabernacle. You see? It's retrospect. He's telling them this is how the journeys happen before the journeys happen. Okay. Now go to Numbers chapter 9. Numbers chapter 9. Now remember, in the book of Numbers, in fact, on your way, just look at Numbers 1:1 one more time. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. Sorry about that. On the first day of the second month, in the second year following the Exodus. So Numbers chapter 1 begins second year, second month, first day. Now go to Numbers 9. Numbers 9, verse 1. Jehovah spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai on the first new moon of the second year following the Exodus from the land of Egypt. Now wait a minute. Numbers chapter 1 puts us in the second month, second year, first day. This now, we're going back 1 month. You follow me? Numbers chapter 9, verse 1 tells us that the material here goes chronologically before Numbers chapter 1. So you can't always do the math like between Exodus 40 and Numbers chapter 1. There's a month. You go, well, yeah, but Numbers chapter 9 is even a month earlier. In fact, look at verse 15. On the day, Numbers 9:15, on the day that the tabernacle was set up. Do we have a day for that? Sure we do. It's the same date from Exodus chapter 40 and Numbers chapter 1, right? The cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the pact, and in the evening it rested over the tabernacle in the likeness of fire until morning. We know when the tabernacle was set up. Go read Exodus 40, right? Now listen, let's keep going. It was always so. The cloud covered it, appearing as fire by night, and whenever the cloud lifted from the tent, the Israelites would set out accordingly, and at the spot where the cloud settled, there the Israelites would make camp. At a command of Jehovah, or at the mouth, P-Yehovah, the mouth of Jehovah, the Israelites broke camp, and at the command or the mouth of Jehovah, they made camp. They remained encamped as long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle. And when the cloud lingered over the tabernacle many days, the Israelites observed Jehovah's mandate and did not journey on. At such times as the cloud rested over the tabernacle for but a few days, they remained encamped at the command of Jehovah and broke camp at command of Jehovah. And at such times as the cloud stayed from evening until morning, they broke camp as soon as the cloud lifted in the morning. Day or night, whenever the cloud lifted, they would break camp. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a year, however long the cloud lingered over the tabernacle, the Israelites remained encamped and did not set out. Only when it lifted did they break camp. On a sign from Jehovah they made camp. On a sign from Jehovah they broke camp. They observed the Lord's command at the Lord's bidding through Moses. So what's the problem? They've yet to move. It's not a problem. I'm just pointing out that this again is an author retrospectively putting into the text. Let me tell you what happened. If the clouds settled for a day or a week or whatever, they didn't move. And the whole readership says, I got you. But when the cloud lifts, the children of Israel move. And all of that, I believe, is true and historically accurate. But you're in chapter 9 of Numbers. Again, go down to chapter 10, verse 11. In the second year, on the 20th day of the second month, the cloud lifted and they set out. The first move, the very first move of the tabernacle, according to Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, is the second year, second month, 20th day. So you see, my point about putting Leviticus chronologically is not quite as simple as sages and scholars have said. It doesn't necessarily have to go at that time in the text. Now, why is it there? We'll talk about that. But I just want you to understand the chronology. There is overlap between these books so that if you put on a piece of paper Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they do this, as particularly Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You see some overlap. So some of the events that are described in Exodus happen also in Leviticus, happen also in Numbers, happen also in Deuteronomy. There's this and not chop, 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 chop. That's my point. You have to slide them on bars. So, for instance, when we get to Leviticus 8 and we deal with the ordination of Aaron and his sons, that's not here in time. In Exodus, where we see the children of Aaron, sons of Aaron being ordained, we have to slide those two together. And then we can look at what each author says. You don't just think that Genesis is older and then, okay, you get it. Beat a dead, that's a wrong, I don't like that impression. Okay. Now, everything that I'm showing you is to get us in the right place. We're going to come back to this. Now, Leviticus chapter 1 through 7 bridges the first two Torah readings. Leviticus chapter 1 through 7 covers a series of sacrifices or offerings. There are different words that are used for these different types of sacrifice. We'll get into that as we need to. For instance, the korban is a word that's used in the Hebrew right out of the gate in Leviticus. And korban is built on a root that means to draw near. So there's something about this particular sacrifice which is intended to draw you near, right? Draw you near what? Draw you near God, okay? And then you have the olah, for instance, which is a wholly consumed burnt offering. And the idea could be, we speculate on the source of the name of the offering, but an olah is something which is wholly consumed on the altar. So olah is from the root word which means to go up. So is it like the smoke of the sacrifice goes up, you know, and it's in that way that it draws its name? Could be. Look at, with me, Leviticus chapter 7. I want to give you the summary first. Leviticus chapter 7, verse 35. These, or those, shall be the perquisites of Aaron and the perquisites of his sons from Jehovah's offering by fire, once they have been inducted to serve Jehovah as priests. These Jehovah commanded to be given them once they had been anointed as a due from the Israelites for all time throughout the ages. Perquisites is sort of rights or privileges is the translation here is what that means. Such, verse 37, such are the rituals of the burnt offering, the meal offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering, the offering of ordination, the sacrifice of well-being, with which Jehovah charged Moses on Mount Sinai when he commanded that the Israelites present their offerings to Jehovah in the wilderness of Sinai. This is a summary of the preceding 7 chapters, which go into great detail as to each of the offerings that I just read. All of these offerings are detailed. It gives us quite a bit of information in chapters 1 through 7. But what I want to focus on is that this clearly says it's presented as having its origin from Jehovah through Moses at Sinai. You see that? It's very clear that that's what the writer is telling us here. Now notice that if you look back at verse 36, these Jehovah commanded to be given them once they had been anointed as a due from the Israelites for all time throughout all ages. Forever, throughout their generations, some translations say. And we could get into the meaning of olam, but I'm telling you that the idea communicated here indicates that this is from God through Moses at Sinai from the time of Moses, and it is to be in place forever. 13 times, all priestly Levitical literature, the phrase that's translated forever throughout their generation, 13 times it appears. It appears in Exodus. It appears in Leviticus. It appears in Numbers. It never appears in Deuteronomy. Okay? Now the question becomes, why? Now we're focusing on Levitical literature. Remember I said, don't think that Levitical literature is just Leviticus. Leviticus is Levitical literature, and it is clearly and solely Levitical literature. It doesn't have other source material. This is Torat Kohanim, priestly material, but priestly material extends into other text. We'll illustrate that quite clearly over the next weeks, months, years, decades, centuries, if I keep it going that long. Burnt offering, meal offering, sin offering, guilt offering, offering of consecration or ordination, some translations say. Sacrifice of well-being, great detail. Now look at Leviticus chapter 6, verse 6. Remember, this is forever. 6, verse 6. A perpetual fire shall be kept burning on the altar. It shall not go out. The altar has to be kept burning, never to go out. So you follow me so far? Sacrifices are forever. The altar is never to go out. This is Levitical literature. Leviticus confirms that only one place is authorized for slaughter. Only one place. You can't just, you're not supposed to, I just heard my grandson say supposed. He always says supposed to. You're not supposed to. So you're not supposed to just sacrifice anywhere. Once we have the tabernacle, which later becomes the tent shrine at Shiloh, and then at Gibeon or Gibeah, and then later the temple, that one place, that's where it happens. Not other places. All right? Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the individual is to kill the animal that they bring, not the priest. The priest deals with the blood. They handle the sacred. In your notes, just put Leviticus 1:5. You can look at that later. So a lot of people don't think about that. Many of these, and I'm using the general term sacrifice, even though I understand that zevak and olah and mincha and all these other words come in. I'm just saying sacrifice because it's easy. It's convenient and we can look at details later. But the idea is that many of these are for food, but some of them are solely associated with ritual and have to do with what I would call the forgiveness factor. Now, by that I mean some of these aren't to be consumed for food, neither by the person who brings it nor by the priest, but they have to do with expiation of guilt or sin, and whether unwitting or not. In other words, a person, and not only an individual, but a group. So unwitting or not, individual or group, some of these are ritual slaughters, and they have to do with expiation, the forgiveness factor. Let me tell you something about Leviticus if you don't know this. Leviticus, repentance alone per Leviticus is not enough. It's not enough. You can't go and just repent and confess, and you can do that. In fact, they say, a lot of these things say, and the person shall confess their whatever, and they bring this particular animal. But you can't just say, forgive me, I'm a sinner. Doesn't work that way. You have to have, according to Leviticus, sacrifice. There is no mention in the book of Leviticus of mercy, repentance, grace, kindness, love. None of these words appear a single time in Leviticus. Sacrifice is the only means of forgiveness. Now, it has to be done in the right approach and so forth, but you can't just have the right approach and no sacrifice. You have to have the sacrifice. And it has to be done in a partnership, a participation, an involvement with a specially anointed cadre called the priest. Right? You got to do it. You don't have the option of going to another place to do it and use another group to help you. It's very, very strict. No exceptions. By the way, has anybody heard of the Messiah? Anybody ever heard of the Messiah? Because I've taught a class, I did a Messiah series, and people would write me and say, but Mr. Nichols, I'm talking about the Messiah. You're talking about a Messiah. I want to know about the Messiah. Okay, so here it is for all those who've said that to me. The only occurrence of HaMashiach in the Bible, Genesis through Malachi, or Genesis through 2 Chronicles, if your Bible is arranged correctly. Here's the deal. The only mention of HaMashiach, the anointed one, is found in Leviticus in this Torah portion. It's used as an adjective. Go with me to Leviticus chapter 4. Here they are. Here are 4 references, the only 4 references on the Messiah in the Bible. And you go, yeah, but what about Isaiah 53? What about the passage in Micah chapter 5? Go look for the word Messiah in those. All right. Now here we go. Leviticus chapter 4, verse 3. If it is the anointed priest who has incurred guilt, so that blame falls upon the people, he shall offer the sin of which he is guilty, a bull of the herd, etc. In the Hebrew, it says Kohen, HaKohen, HaMashiach. If the priest, the anointed one. In other words, in Hebrew, the adjective follows the noun. We tend to treat the word Messiah as a noun, a proper noun or whatever, the Messiah, but really it's an adjective. It is the anointed one, the one who is anointed. So here it says the priest, the anointed one. In English, we would straighten that out and say the anointed priest. Now look at verse 5. And the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood. The HaKohen HaMashiach. Look at verse 16 of chapter 4. By the way, this is the most anointed chapter in the Bible. It's a little joke for you. Verse 16, the anointed